Lewin flicked his finger towards Michael's head using high-level explosion magic. This, of course, shocked the students, as Lewin's magic could have easily shattered Michael's head into pieces. Dust and debris from the explosion scattered throughout the arena between Lewin and Mikkel. Lewin stared sharply at Mikkel as if he already knew what had happened to him. Mikkel only smirked after receiving the magic attack from Lewin. Lewin then struck Mikkel again with high-powered magic. Michael's body was thrown backward from the impact of Lewin's blow. He was flung, and his head hit a large rock hard. Although he was repeatedly struck with full-force magic, it seemed that Mikkel felt no pain at all. Lewin thought this condition was not favorable for Mikkel because he could die from the accumulation of blows. Lewin pulled Michael's body and lifted him up. He threw Mikkel upwards and locked him with prison tree magic so that Mikkel couldn't move. Lewin raised his hand and spoke loudly, stating that Mikkel had used illegal drugs. The match supervisor approached him to inquire about Lewin's statement. Lewin felt confident that someone could create drugs that couldn't be detected. What do you mean? The match supervisor still didn't understand what Lewin was saying. Lewin explained that there was someone who could create illegal drugs without being detected. The match supervisor thought there was only one person skilled in pharmaceuticals in the academy. The match supervisor asked, "Do you mean Professor Elric is behind this?" Meanwhile, Professor Heidel and Professor Tyran observed the conversation between Lewin and the match supervisor about the potential cheating in the exam. Apparently, Professor Elric hurriedly approached Lewin and asked what Lewin meant by thinking like that. "Did you suspect Mikkel of using illegal drugs?" Lewin firmly stated that he had evidence. Professor Elric challenged Lewin to undergo another test for illegal drug use. However, Lewin refused because he knew Professor Elric used a special elixir that could hide indications of illegal drug use. Professor Elric then asked Lewin about his plan to prove his accusation. "I will prove what Lewin said," Lewin said as he picked up a large rock nearby. Lewin flicked his finger towards the large rock, causing it to shatter into pieces with a loud bang. Lewin explained that what he did to Mikkel was a magic attack like this. However, instead of feeling pain, Mikkel laughed as if he hadn't been attacked at all. Mikkel continued to laugh without feeling any pain even though he had been struck multiple times by Lewin with great force. "Do you still refuse to admit it, Professor Elric?" Lewin asked Professor Elric, who was now sweating with fear. "Professor Elric." Professor Tyran suddenly shouted, calling Professor Elric's name loudly. Professor Elric was surprised, as if he had anticipated what would happen to him. Professor Tyran looked at Professor Elric with angry eyes. Professor Tyran hadn't expected Professor Elric to do something forbidden during this sacred exam. He ordered Professor Elric to follow him to his office. Meanwhile, Professor Elric could only remain silent and comply with Professor Tyran's command. Lewin and the match supervisor remained silent as they watched Professor Elric being reprimanded by Professor Tyran, the Academy's dean. Meanwhile, Mikkel looked as if he were laughing like a madman. After the exam ended, rumors spread throughout the Academy that Professor Elric had been fired from the Academy and Mikkel expelled. Additionally, the corruption case involving the Gary Hill family began to be openly circulated. Meanwhile, Lewin began to be widely known at the Academy as the person who caused Mikkel to be expelled from the Academy for cheating during the exam. Lewin was summoned by the dean to a room with a very large door. Lewin didn't know what kind of room he was being called to. He couldn't guess why the dean suddenly summoned him. Lewin entered the room with the large door. He looked surprised to see the scenery behind the large door. He saw a chair in the middle of a beautiful green garden. He looked happy. The scenery in front of him resembled the atmosphere of Ardell, his homeland, and he was amazed to see a magnificent red throne in front of him. It was the throne of Theron, the seat of the Magician Kings. Then why was it here? Lewin wondered in his heart. "What do you see, Lewin?" Suddenly, the dean approached him. Professor Tyran invited Lewin to explore the garden. He explained that this place was created by the Eye of Malarok. He was the first demon leader to invade the continent of Frelia. He had the ability to force his target to see what he wanted them to see. After his death, parts of the eye of Malarok's body were made into artifacts. Professor Tyran explained that the world Lewin had just seen should depict the world Lewin aspired to see. Lewin thought that his vision matched his aspirations, which were to see the rise of Ardell and become the king of the magicians. Professor Tyran asked, "Don't you know what I once saw in this palace?" Lewin didn't answer that he didn't know, and he was curious to know what Professor Tyran's vision was like. Professor Tyran explained that he saw a world where students behaved like students and magicians behaved like magicians. But, of course, this wasn't easy to achieve. They both left the room and continued their conversation in Professor Tyran's room. Lewin casually sipped the coffee served by the professor, while the professor looked at him with a cool gaze. The professor said that he called Lewin because there was something he wanted to ask. Professor Tyran asked how Lewin could detect that Mikkel had used illegal drugs. Lewin was slightly surprised by the professor's question, but he couldn't possibly explain the truth that he possessed the player eye ability. Lewin explained that he suspected Mikkel had used burning flour based on the signs he exhibited. However, it seemed that Professor Tyran believed that Lewin didn't just suspect, but was certain that Mikkel had consumed illegal drugs. The professor suspected that Lewin had some special ability. Lewin continued to try to convince the professor that he used physical strength, not magic power. Moreover, in that place, magic power was limited by barriers, while physical strength was not. Additionally, the fact that Mikkel didn't feel pain even after being attacked multiple times strengthened Lewin's suspicion that Mikkel must have used burning flour. Professor Tyran calmly listened to Lewin's explanation. He was impressed by Lewin's sharp observation skills, allowing him to quickly assess changes in his opponent. Furthermore, Lewin demonstrated composure in responding to such situations. Professor Tyran apologized for not anticipating such an event during the exam. He also wanted to offer Lewin the opportunity to represent the Academy at the upcoming Grand Festival. Lewin was slightly surprised by the offer from Professor Tyran. Being the Academy's representative at the Grand Festival was a dream for many students, and he had already expected to be given that opportunity. Although he had anticipated it, Lewin seemed to be considering something. He thanked the dean for giving him the chance to participate in the grand event, but doubted whether he could do his best for the Academy because he hadn't achieved much so far. However, Professor Tyran explained that this was precisely what made it interesting because their competitors at the Grand Festival would never know Lewin's identity beforehand. Lewin would be a secret weapon for the Academy. Lewin understood Professor Tyran's point. Unlike Mikkel, who was already popular, he was a relatively unknown student outside the Academy, so he could be a surprise at the event. So, what do you think? Are you willing to be the Academy's representative? Professor Tyran asked Lewin again. Lewin agreed to accept the offer and promised to do his best at the Grand Festival to represent the Academy. Professor Tyran suddenly welcomed someone into his room. He thought that Lewin needed to train in physical techniques. Therefore, he wanted to introduce Lewin to a physical technique trainer. Lewin was surprised by the newcomer introduced as his trainer by the professor. He seemed to have seen this trainer before. The trainer entered and greeted Lewin. He was Golter Paranti, the leader of the Knight Order from the Foldron region. He also belonged to the 6th class of the 5 Knights in the Radiant Kingdom. Lewin remembered that this trainer was the person he had worked with during the exam against the orc. Apparently, the professor allowed the two of them to talk to get to know each other. The knight asked Lewin about the news he heard from Professor Tyran that Lewin couldn't fight except using close-range techniques. Lewin admitted to the news. The knight explained that from what he saw last time when Lewin fought the orc, Lewin had pretty good movements. However, Lewin seemed not to have properly studied martial arts techniques. Lewin's martial arts movements might be effective against ogres, but for experienced knights, Lewin's movements could be easily seen and defeated. Lewin acknowledged the truth of the knight's words. So far, he had only practiced repetitive movements to complete quest orders. He didn't have many combat technique movements. The knight assured that Lewin would change. He would teach him proper martial arts techniques. The knight asked if they should start practicing now. They began to practice. The first thing Lewin learned was the walking technique. By learning the correct way to walk, Lewin could train his body techniques well. In addition, Lewin also learned the heavenly martial arts technique, which was a martial arts technique commonly taught by knights. Lewin practiced the movements taught by the knight. According to the knight, heavenly martial arts consisted of 36 martial arts movements, not including sword techniques. Lewin practiced hand-striking techniques properly to be able to exert his power. One by one, Lewin learned basic martial arts techniques. Meanwhile, the knight closely observed every martial arts movement made by Lewin. The knight smiled seeing Lewin's enthusiasm for training. Lewin asked the knight why he was teaching him martial arts techniques when it wasn't beneficial for the knight. It even made the knight have to come to the academy every day. The knight only replied that he considered it an investment. An investment? Lewin didn't understand what the knight meant. The knight explained that he had just met a great magician candidate, and he wanted to help realize that magician's future. Wasn't that a profitable investment? Lewin fell silent hearing the knight's answer. In that case, I am under your supervision now, Professor Golter, Lewin said, bowing respectfully to the knight. The knight chuckled slightly at Lewin's formal behavior, although he was not much older than Lewin. Lewin was surprised that his trainer was still young. Lewin resumed practicing using proper and accurate punching techniques. He practiced walking movements accompanied by punches to manage the balance of his body movements. Golter, the knight, smiled seeing Lewin practicing. He thought Lewin had good talent for fighting. He remembered when Lewin managed to break an orc's jaw with his punch. For him, Lewin was a melee-type magician and stronger than an orc. And so, for 3 weeks, Lewin trained his martial arts skills. He even gained an increase in some of his skills. In addition to having high magic power, he now had improved martial arts abilities. Moreover, mastering the heavenly martial arts technique raised his rank to level 3. His power had now reached 2130, and he could feel it clearly. Strang didn't expect Lewin's strength to increase so quickly. When he followed Draka, to reach a power of 2000, Draka had to spend more than a year. But Lewin said, wasn't there a difference in the perception of time between humans and dragons? Suddenly, Lewin was startled by Jason's loud call as he ran towards him. Haven't you seen it yet? Jason asked breathlessly. According to Jason, the participants for the Grand Festival had already been announced on the Academy's notice board. Lewin was surprised to hear the news from Jason. When entering the Academy, Lewin was honored as the student representative to advance to the podium at the opening event for new Academy students. Of course, this made many people jealous and suspicious of Lewin. The fact that Lewin had to spend 5 years as a disabled magician unable to use magic seemed to answer their suspicions. During those 5 years, Lewin had to witness the treatment of students towards Mikkel, who was always praised and had many friends. However, Lewin, who is now no longer a student who could be underestimated for not being able to use basic magic, had transformed into an Academy student with extraordinary magical abilities, even becoming the Academy's representative at the Grand Festival event. Lewin Ardell and Jason approached the crowd of students who were looking at the Academy announcement board. Lewin was happy to see his name displayed on the board as the Academy representative for the upcoming Grand Festival event. He became an individual representative who would compete in the Grand Festival. This was a great achievement for him. Other students greeted Lewin happily. They cheered and believed that Lewin would honor the Academy's name at the event. What was most enjoyable for Lewin was that he returned to being the Academy's representative after 5 years of being mocked and belittled by others. Professor Haydel spoke to Lewin. He was surprised to hear from Golter that Lewin had already mastered heavenly martial arts. According to the professor, this was a great achievement for Lewin's young age of only 16. He was amazed at Lewin's rapid development of abilities. The professor was confident that Lewin could achieve even greater progress. After spending some time training with Golter to prepare for the great tournament, Lewin finally felt ready. The big event had arrived, taking place in Altian. The Academy's representative students were ready at the station to depart for the tournament venue. They seemed excited to ride the Mana train, a train they had never ridden before. Among the students who praised Lewin, there were still some who looked down on him. They belittled Lewin, claiming he couldn't possibly win the tournament. They thought Lewin's recent achievements were merely luck. Other students responded that if Mikkel were still the representative, the outcome might have been different. It seemed they still admired Mikkel, the arrogant student who had been expelled from the academy for cheating in exams. Jason, hearing the students belittling Lewin, felt annoyed. Meanwhile, Lewin just stared sharply at those students, who turned out to be Michael's friends and always took advantage of the Gary Hill family. Because of that, they would never be friendly towards Lewin. Lewin just smiled sarcastically. He quietly remarked that those students were just a bunch of loyal dogs who had lost their master. One of the students who heard Lewin's words felt offended and approached him. The student sarcastically asked if this was the attitude of a respected academy representative. Lewin replied that the great tournament was a good opportunity to test their learning experience at the academy. If they achieved good results in the tournament, they would have many opportunities and wouldn't need the Gary Hill family anymore. The student responded harshly, saying that could only happen if Lewin achieved good results in the tournament. The great tournament was filled with monsters that were impossible to defeat. In the end, they would be destined to work for the Gary Hill family in the Radiant Kingdom. So there was no need to dream of winning the big tournament. But Lewin assured them that they could achieve good results in the Grand Festival tournament later. Lewin continued that cooperation among students was important in this competition, so disruptive elements needed to be eliminated as they were only obstacles. The arrogant student became even more annoyed with Lewin's words. He asked Lewin if he would compete without them. Lewin just smiled and told the students to think about whom they truly represented. Moreover, currently there were no Gary Hill families who would appreciate their obedience. The student clenched his teeth in anger. It turned out the arrogant student was still upset with Lewin and threatened not to obey Lewin in the tournament later. And the train carried them to the location of the Grand Festival tournament in Altian. Inside the train, some students who were riding the Mana train for the first time were amazed by its extraordinary speed. Strang, who was also on the journey, was happy because the train they were riding was faster than when he was with Draka. Jason's joy at seeing the beautiful scenery outside was slightly disturbed by the voices of people belittling them, the academy students. It turned out the voices came from 3 arrogant academy students. They were from the Iota National Magic Academy. The Iota National Magic Academy was the only academy in the Iota Desert Kingdom built in the desert. The students at this academy were known for forging their sword and body skills to the maximum limit. Lewin wondered why they suddenly appeared in their train car. Apparently, they were looking for Mikkel, whom they knew as the loser who always ranked last in tournaments. They laughed and mocked because Mikkel, the academy representative, always got a lower position than them. In a mocking tone, they said that Lewin and his friends would surely get the last position again in the tournament. Lewin remained silent, ignoring the insults from the other academy students. Lewin understood that the academy where he learned magic was underestimated by other academies. Lewin stared sharply at the students who belittled their academy as if he wanted to prove something. Meanwhile, Professor Heidel, who was accompanying the group of students, ignored the disrespectful words of those rude students from other academies. The Grand Festival event was held specifically for academy students, while the professors were only guides and were not allowed to interfere in the affairs of the students who would participate in the tournament. Lewin felt a great responsibility as the academy representative to honor their academy's name. The students from the Iota National Magic Academy continued to insult them and asked Hankus, one of Lewin's teammates, about Michael's whereabouts. Mikkel was in the hospital. Suddenly, a student's voice caught them by surprise. It was Lewin's voice, the hero of our story. Lewin's friend explained to the arrogant students that it was Lewin, the representative of their academy. The arrogant students were surprised because they didn't know Lewin. Then, they approached Lewin, who was standing next to Jason. The arrogant students introduced themselves as Theta Malkiri, representatives from Iota. Lewin introduced himself to Theta Malkiri as Lewin Ardell. Lewin said, "If you're done babbling, please leave this car." Lewin continued, "You should apologize for insulting our academy as the last place." Lewin's words certainly made Theta Malkiri angry. He yelled, asking, "Why should I apologize?" Theta shouted at Hankus, demanding to know why he hadn't told this person who he was. He was furious and threatened to beat Hankus. Lewin understood why Academy students participating in the tournament were afraid when they met students from the Iota Academy. Apparently, they were often threatened and beaten by students from the Iota Academy. Lewin just smiled and didn't feel afraid facing Theta Malkiri, the arrogant student. The arrogant student threatened to hit Lewin for speaking out of turn. Suddenly, a professor from the Iota Academy arrived and shouted at Theta to stop the quarrel. Theta was surprised to see the professor and dared not argue back. The professor scolded Theta for causing chaos and seeking enemies before the competition. Feeling uneasy, the professor apologized to Professor Heidel because their academy's students had misbehaved. The professor ordered Theta to return to his seat. With annoyance, Theta threatened Lewin and returned to his seat. Meanwhile, Lewin didn't care about the threats from Theta, the arrogant student. In his seat, Theta asked the professor sitting next to him why he had stopped the fight. "Wasn't this the professor's idea? Didn't you see?" the professor asked Theta Malkiri. Theta didn't understand what the professor meant. The professor explained that when Theta was arguing, Professor Heidel only smiled. It seemed to indicate that Professor Heidel was confident about this tournament. The professor thought that the person named Lewin seemed to have something. He was not like Mikkel. Theta Malkiri somewhat understood the professor's words. He had to be careful with Lewin Ardell. The train continued to move through the expanse of green trees towards the competition venue. The academy students seemed surprised to hear that the first match was a group competition without representatives, so Lewin wouldn't participate. They looked pessimistic without Lewin among them. However, other students tried to convince their friends to remain enthusiastic even without Lewin on their team. The arrogant and selfish student eventually agreed to join the team in the upcoming competition. One of Lewin's friends approached him and asked about Lewin's condition after arguing with students from the Iota Academy. Lewin instead asked, "Aren't you angry when our academy is insulted? Shouldn't you be angry at those who underestimate our academy?" Lewin continued his speech. "If I remain silent, maybe they will arrogantly insult and belittle our academy. Do you want to be constantly insulted?" The students just remained silent, ashamed. Lewin seemed frustrated with his friend's attitude of not defending the academy when insulted by students from other academies. Lewin assured them that now was not the time to argue and be divided. Suddenly, a student who was Michael's friend suggested Hankus as the gatekeeper in the upcoming arrow ball match. Lewin smiled slightly because finally, Michael's arrogant friend agreed to join their group. The train arrived at their destination, the Altian Duchy station, and they hurriedly got off the train. The Altian Duchy was one of the territories of the Raynak Empire Federation. This territory was recognized as a neutral territory within the empire. If bloodshed occurred in Altian, the Raynak Empire would intervene to judge their actions. That's why big competitions like the Grand Festival were held in this area. The academy students walked towards the Grand Festival competition venue. They seemed surprised to see the city's landscape with magnificent buildings. Meanwhile, Lewin set foot in this city for the first time. Lewin saw the city's inhabitants living their lives casually. Moreover, there were many large and unique buildings in this city. This made Lewin realize that they were people from remote areas. They were instructed by the professor to go to the accommodation place by riding horse-drawn carriages. And several horse-drawn carriages took them to the booked accommodation. Professor Heidel advised Lewin not to enter other academies' accommodations even accidentally. The professor said Lewin shouldn't respond to provocations from students from other academies as it would be pointless. Lewin wondered why the professor said that while looking at him. Suddenly, Strang shouted at Lewin to look out the window. Lewin was surprised by Strang's shout and looked out the window as indicated by Strang. Lewin felt a sense of intrigue wash over him. Strang suddenly jumped down. He sensed something he knew. It turned out there was Draka's relic in this place. The next day at the Ignat Academy Inn, Lewin was seen rushing out, leaving Jason behind. He hurriedly left the inn, sensing the power of the avatar of strength. He instructed Strang to open the mini-map for better understanding. Lewin headed to the Elixir souvenir shop in one corner of Althean City. Upon entering the shop, he looked around. He thought that since the artifact had been used by the Black Dragon, it would likely be in a unique place. Previously, he speculated that the Draka artifact would be found in the underground market rather than in a regular shop like this. Strang explained that the Draka artifact was only useful for magicians like himself. For regular magicians, the artifact was like useless trash. Lewin activated the player eye to observe the items in the shop. He noticed one item emitting a red light aura, catching his attention. The player eye identified the item as the Ring of Invulnerability. It was an artifact created by Draka, but also considered a failure. A failure? Lewin didn't understand what that meant. The item was useful for warding off physical contact, even from loved ones. It made sense that it was also called a failure because it could activate at inappropriate times. However, it could increase strength by up to 200 when used. Lewin decided to try on the ring on his finger. The ring fit perfectly on his finger. Lewin Ardell intended to buy the ring and approached the shopkeeper. However, the shopkeeper was about to give the ring to Lewin without payment. According to the shopkeeper, the ring had been sitting there for a long time, and its usefulness was uncertain. Since the shopkeeper gave him the ring for free, Lewin decided to purchase another item. Using the player eye, Lewin scanned every item in the shop to find something interesting for him. Suddenly, Lewin's eyes fell on an item in the souvenir shop. Apparently, he was interested in a quantum mechanics of magic and swords item. However, as he was about to take the item, a girl also tried to grab it. Lewin stared at the girl who was just fighting over the item with him. Through the player eye, Lewin learned that the girl was a 5th-class magician named Irene Prius with very high potential. She hailed from the Seiki Special Women's Academy. Irene Prius was one of the 11 next-generation magicians chosen by Terran Artemis. Lewin continued to gaze sharply at Irene Prius. Meanwhile, the girl just stood there silently, observing Lewin, who was staring at her. The girl asked Lewin to release the item they were fighting over. However, Lewin refused because he felt he had grabbed it first. The girl introduced herself to Lewin. She hoped Lewin would let her buy the item because she knew Lewin had already obtained another item earlier, while Irene came to the shop just to get that item. Lewin looked sharply at Irene, who asked him to let her buy the book. Lewin asked Irene why she was buying the book when usually people ignored it. Irene was slightly surprised by Lewin's sudden question. She claimed that the book was needed for her personal assignment. Irene couldn't specify her task. Lewin tried to guess. Was it a task from the Flame King? Irene didn't expect Lewin to guess the task she was working on. Finally, Lewin agreed to give Irene the book item, and Irene thanked Lewin. Irene still seemed to be watching Lewin busy, searching for the item he intended to buy. Upon returning to the inn, Lewin told Jason and his friend about his encounter with Irene Prius. Jason and his friend seemed surprised. He asked what Lewin was going to do next and how they met. Lewin then told them about his encounter with Irene to the two of his friends. Jason seemed jealous of Lewin for being able to meet Irene, but his friend laughed because he had sat next to her during the previous festival event. Lewin seemed displeased because it turned out his friend had been close to Irene. His friend explained that Irene had great abilities, but unfortunately, she was always in second place after Doom Prime. Because of that, she seemed pressured. Jason, hearing his friend's story, looked annoyed because he felt his friend was underestimating Irene. His friend continued his explanation that Irene held the first position in the Rainak Magic Army Training Academy. That meant she was the most famous wizard among her peers in all regions on this continent. She also possessed the Sword of Radiance. Hearing the explanation from his friend, Lewin finally understood why Irene wanted that book so much. She seemed to intend to defeat Doom Prime. However, becoming a magic swordsman wasn't as easy as that. Magic swords didn't offer as much enhancement as other weapons, and becoming skilled in swordsmanship like a knight wasn't easy either. His friend said Doom Prime was different. The Sword of Radiance was an S-class artifact. Moreover, his level of swordsmanship was at least equal to an ordinary knight's. Jason felt jealous of Irene, who had high abilities and also came from a prestigious and wealthy family. Besides, Irene was very popular. Meanwhile, Lewin still couldn't figure out what kind of person Irene was. Irene Prius had mastered 5th class magic at the age of 16. Meanwhile, Doom Prime was the one who always defeated Irene every year. Lewin began to doubt if he could defeat them. Lewin felt he was just an ordinary person who was not noticed by others. However, he remembered Professor Tyron's words that it was not impossible for him to become a winning candidate. Surprisingly, another student entered and said that the first lineup for the Grand Festival opening ceremony was out. Lewin smiled, finding it intriguing, and he stepped out to see it. Meanwhile, Jason and his friend followed behind him.